was sort of inevitable. There was no budget to maintain the place, so it was something called recycling. The materials were being put to better use, but it wasn't particularly good to have that on the front page of the Washington Post. The image in America is you don't loot. The Philippine Air Force was assigned to the security of Clark, but it really didn't have the capability or the budget to take care of that any more than Subic had the $100 million budget to maintain Subic, although they organized volunteers. You know that story there under the former Mayor Dick Gordon to do their best until they got some locators. So Subic prospered. Subic got the World Bank loan, $30 million, I recall. The loan was used to upgrade the runway, and in came FedEx as an anchor tenant, and in came Acer as an anchor tenant, and you know the story at Subic. But the reason I was so depressed on that day in March of 1992 when I visited here was because nothing was happening. I'd been used to Clark. We would bring senior visitors up here to the 13th Air Force headquarters, and the commanding general of the 13th Air Force would give the usual briefing. The Red Air Forces of North Korea and China and Vietnam were up there in an arc across the north of Asia, and then the Allied Air Forces of Singpak Af and the Thais and the Japanese and the South Koreans were in blue in the south, and that building now is where CDC is. And Clark was extremely busy with 20,000 U.S. military personnel, with 30-some thousand Filipino employees, with families on base and off base, with aircraft landing constantly. And to come from that to a place covered in ash with no activity was really depressing. But there was one activity. 3 holes of the golf course had been cleared of ash. There were caddies and golfers. So that says something about the Philippine military following a tradition of American military, because you go to American military bases and you'll find golf courses. I'll make an aside. I'm an Army brat. I grew up in the U.S. Army in various bases, and don't think that American military are conservative. Dennis, you'll agree, it's a very socialized organization. You get discounted haircuts, you get discounted movie theaters, you get golf courses and everything else, and generous retirement benefits. But that was Clark in the past and Subic in the past. This was the largest U.S. air base outside the United States. Dramatic changes occurred. There had been assassinations here. People who lived here a long time will recall what happened at the gates of Clark one afternoon when 4 American enlisted personnel during the shift were in traffic. These assassins came up. They went by women who were driving the cars because they weren't going to go after women. They went by African Americans, and they assassinated 4 enlisted men. That was a decision of the Central Committee of the NDF to use that technique for their advocacy of getting the American military out of the country. Maybe they were working on a long-term plan to capture the West Philippine Sea. That certainly is the contemporary connection with what was going on. But in truth, they were copying the mouse, and they're still copying the mouse. There are not so many of them around Central Luzon anymore. And of course, they're way out of date. Like many things in the Philippines, they're way out of date. If they played catch-up, they'd all be seeking jobs at call centers in the Philippines, in Clark, at Sutherland and others. But they're probably not qualified for that. So I'm being nostalgic. I've been coming here for years. I'm going to be 70 next month, and I expect to continue to come here. I'm not qualified to be in the cemetery that Clark Global City is supporting because I wasn't in the military, but I assure you I will spend the afterlife in the Philippines. It's my home. I also should say my other connection with Clark is that my wife has a carpet factory here. And I'll make an advertisement for, not that I'm selling carpets, but you should be aware that the quality of the carpets is the world's best. And the customers for these carpets are the world's richest. And they include Bill Gates, they include palaces in Kuwait and around the Gulf states, they include the best hotels in the world, they're the best carpets in the world. They're quite expensive, I should say, New Zealand wool and Filipino labor. But there's a factory right here at the Filixel industrial estate. By the way, Filixel was the first locator at Clark. Back when there was a lot of ash around, they came in. The owners in New York had been invited by Ambassador Pelaez and President Ramos to come in. I was President Aquino, actually, at that time, to come in and take a look and make an investment here. They were the largest company at the time in garment exports in the Philippines. And I think they made a good decision when it was very difficult to make that kind of decision because it's very difficult to see the future. And Clark Global City is a complement or a successor to that early investor who also has a vision for what the future can hold. And as you can see from the success of Filixel, which is pretty full here now, the lesson is to see the future and have the patience to realize the future. You cannot come into the Philippines, make an effort, and then expect instant results. You have to be patient. You have to have a long-term perspective, and in almost all cases, that will pay off. I want to divert and tell you about Arrancada, because I'm up here in my position as working with the Joint Foreign Chambers, and I want to tell you about a book whose recommendations can affect the success of your businesses. Four years ago, 300 investors, Filipino and domestic, met in a series of 9 focus group discussions, and Clark was represented in the one on airports. In fact, I see the representative walking by, and you remember in the focus group discussion we had in Makati, the passion of people arguing for the travelers who happen to live sort of north of the Pasig River as opposed to the people living south of the Pasig River. I guess the Guadalupe Bridge is the dividing line in this. And those of us living in Makati, of course, we're thinking we just zip over to Naia, and that's our airport of choice. But suddenly we became aware that for an equal population, and I think there's a slide that Chicos had presented down in Makati a few months ago that showed the basin or the catchment basin of the population, and it's very telling that you have, and it's a huge number of people that are living in the northern part of Manila, which is a huge megalopolis, and up into Central Luzon, and if you compare that to the huge number of people that are living in the southern part of the national capital region going down to Quezon province, you have large populations, which is an argument later on that I would make for having a dual airport strategy. Let's forget about what you read in the paper about a single airport. In fact, the guy who got me into this today, Ben Solis, is in the Inquirer today talking to the press about this issue. Arrancada is on a website, arrancadaphilippines.com. You can read about it. And what we do is we advocate 470 reforms that were made by these investors. So in that sense, the investors represent you, private sector, companies doing business in the Philippines in 7 big winner sectors: agribusiness, creative industries, business processing, infrastructure, manufacturing, mining, tourism. 7 big winter sectors. These are very familiar to my friend at the BOI because they're really the same sectors that are in the investment priority plan. I'm not going to pull a Senator Soto and say I plagiarized Faye. I think we're partners in this and we see the same vision together. We have the same crystal ball. But our conclusion was that if these recommendations are put into effect, we could generate $75 billion in foreign investment. Of course, you get a lot of domestic investment too, and an estimated 10 million jobs and 1 trillion pesos in revenue for the government over a period of about 10 years. Now that's beginning to happen. We also had a sub-motto, twice as fast, because arrancada means to accelerate. Everybody here speaks Ilocano only, or Pump? If anybody here speak Tagalog, then I understand arrancada. Lilia de Lima said it's what a jeepney driver says, right? He's going up a hill in first gear, and he's about to stall. So he downshifts and gives it the gas, and he goes, arrancada. Well, I see another friend, Bernie. Hi, here's Dr. Bernie Villegas from the University Asian Pacific and a Harvard PhD in economics. He has a much more interesting story to tell you than I have, so maybe I should wind up here quickly. I mentioned our website. We have had over 38,000 unique visitors from 144 countries, but 75% of them come from the Philippines, and then the next large group is the United States. We have a big event, and some of you, if you're in Manila, I encourage you to come. It's 8:30 to 2 in the ballroom of the Shangri-La. Last year, the President was with us. This year, the President is campaigning. Our keynote speaker is the Speaker of the House, Sonny Belmonte of Quezon City. If you haven't heard him, he's got a very strong story to tell about legislative successes in the Congress that is about to finish. And we have Secretary of Tourism, Secretary of Trade, NCC, Co-Chairman Bill Luce, and 30 other speakers. So if you can come down in Manila, I know that Chicos, you signed up. I hope you're able to come and join us and we'll put you right up there at the front table with all the other VIPs. The reason I talk about arrancada, because this bears on the future of Clark. What happens in the growth of the economy overall, what happens particularly in Central Luzon, and you realize that this is the higher income area, the higher growth area of the entire country, affects Clark. So some of these sectors are going to be at Clark, some of them are going to be around Clark. All of them certainly should be included in the Aerotropolis concept that Mr. Brady is explaining later today. And we have specific recommendations for each of these sectors. Agribusiness, business process outsourcing, which is already here, creative industries, which I suspect is, if anybody sings, anybody dances, anybody, in the future there will be a Psy doing the Philippine Gangnam style, or whatever the copy of that is going to make the same success around the world. So you get an idea about creative industries. There's a lot of talent there, and the Congress has just passed a bill for the Design Council. I'll be going to the President shortly. Yeah. Infrastructure, we have many, many issues there. We have a whole panel on this next week. Airports is important, power, roads and rail, seaports, telecom, water. Manufacturing and logistics. Well, that's right up the alley of Clark. You have that already, and you have potential, huge potential. Not sure about mining. Sorry, how do I go backwards? Mining. There's a bit of a hiatus on that right now, but hopefully it may not affect your area here immediately, but it is important to the country as a whole. And tourism, which including medical travel and retirement, are extremely important for Clark in the future. They're important today. I'm sure you have profiles of the people that are flying on the aircraft coming in here, and whether they're business people or whether they're tourists or whether they're Balikbayans or OFWs, etc. We have a general area called business costs, or the business environment, which is about a dozen things that affect the climate of all these other big sectors. And the costs, you all know what the costs are if you're in business. And some of them are good, like rents. Some of them are not so good, like power or telecommunications. We're worried about the environment and natural disasters. Governance, big issue. It was only 20 years ago that the head of the World Bank used the big C word, corruption. We used to call it governance. Well, I still call it governance, but it means corruption. Number one problem for investors in the country, until recently. No longer number one problem, but it could in the future again be the number one problem. Number two problem was infrastructure. That's now number one problem. Judicial, there are quite a few, sorry, moving, pushing it. Anybody control it by the next slide, by hand? Oh, okay. Judicial, I won't go in again in the book. Justice is slow, justice is unpredictable. If I have a chance to talk about used car smuggling, front page showing the VOC commissioner up in Santa Ana municipality, and today it's a case of slow justice and other things. Legislation, we do a lot of work on legislation with the House and Senate and with Philippine business groups, with Makati Business Club, MAP, PCCI, large range of groups. We're happy to hear from you about legislative needs, amendments to laws, new laws that you may be interested in. Macroeconomic policy, including trade policies, such future cutting trade agreements as the ASEAN Economic Community, as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as the EU, the Philippine bilateral FTA, and of course social services, which include education, major reforms in this government. It's taken 75 years to increase high school to 12 years since the American Commonwealth period, but it's going to happen. Health and population, to expand, fill health out to everybody in the country, not just make it a middle class entitlement. Population, Bernie, with all due respect, reproductive health with some compromises. The issue has been legislatively resolved at least. We have a disagreement on it. We're great friends, but and that's we're all well aware of the different points of view because they were well articulated. And poverty, the CCT program, the fact that with the high population, because of corruption in the past, poor governance, that the poverty level here is very persistent. As I said earlier, I see Subic and Clark as a single region. I think we should keep this in mind. You've seen the map before. You live here. You know of the connections. But the U.S. left a treasure to the Philippines when Pinatubo erupted, and then after the political eruption of the Philippine Senate, whether they're called the Dirty Dozen or the Dozen Heroes, depending on where you sit. The U.S. military left. The physical facilities were not removed. If they cost $6 or $8 billion to taxpayers like Mr. Wright and myself, and Mr. Brady are too young to have paid taxes in that period, but we paid our taxes, and some of them came back here to build and maintain these facilities, which now are a heritage for the Philippine government to protect and develop. In this slide, which I used at Subic, I point out the underutilization of the two terminals, Phase 1 and Phase 2, of the container terminal that's over at QB Point in Subic, which have a capacity of 600,000 TEUs annually, but are utilized in 2010 at only 4%. Now that's an underinvestment. That's a plan of the government to use the port of Subic, but without a policy to actually get the cargo there. And it's a deep water port. We had similar, I mean, what we're doing here, and this is one of the, in fact, we were with the Secretary of Transportation yesterday talking these issues, is something Bangkok faced before, something Saigon faced before. You know, all of these cities in Southeast Asia grew up at river mouths. There were no roads. The oceans were the rivers. And now they're large cities like Bangkok and Ho Chi Minh and Manila. And yet, you're still using the ports in the middle of the city. Now, Bangkok capped the Bangkok port and built a new port in Lam Chabang. Same thing in Ho Chi Minh. They capped the port of Saigon, which is right in the middle of the city, if you recall, and built a new one, a deepwater port at Cat Lai. Philippines is not doing that. The president opened berth 6 at the International Container Terminal at the Manila port last year. And there's a contract to do berth 7. And you saw in the paper this week, PPA talking about building, filling in another 200 hectares and having a bulk oil port. Now that doesn't make sense because you guys don't have traffic here at Clark. But every Saturday, those of us who live in Makati and try to go to downtown Manila face a caravan of 40-foot trucks moving slowly. And we have 40% of the traffic in Manila is attributable to the congestion that comes from using that port. There's a perfectly good port at Batangas and a perfectly good port at Subic. And Subic is a deep water port. Subic can take Panamax freighters, which cannot come into Manila port. The big ones, maybe not post-Panamax, which is the next generation, but the cost of shipping in the Philippines can come down $300 per container, 40-footer, to go to the United States if you can get the larger ships in. But you can't get the larger ships in without the volume of exports. Now you're starting that volume of exports here at Clark with Yokohama. Huge exporter. If you can duplicate that 10 or 20 times, you'll start to use Subic more. It doesn't make sense to go into Manila to export. So there are lessons from Thailand and Vietnam which we must follow here. You decongest by building new port capacity away from the urban centers. Well, we've done that. Support the road infrastructure. Supporting road infrastructure must connect the new ports to the export manufacturing zones. Well, we've done that. The road all the way down to the port of Batangas, these SLECs, and we've done it to Subic. And we will, in the next 3 years, have the connector between SLECs and NLECs. And after that, we'll have C6. So that road infrastructure is going in. But we don't have the incentives to fully utilize the capacity of the new ports, not yet. We're working on it. And then to actually, through policy, administrative or otherwise, cap the port and use the Port of Manila increasingly for tourism. You have 3 National Museum buildings. You have Intramuros. You can have cruise ships coming into that area for a shopping and cultural destination. That vision is there, but the execution is slowly coming. Now, Clark and Subic started off in the middle of disaster. It's nice, I just got a 15-minute warning, which is very helpful, rather than the 5-minute warning when you're halfway through your speech. If you can read these headlines, they come from 1996 and 1997. FedEx Subic hub opens flight routes. Acer opens biggest plant outside Taiwan. Hutchinson asked court to stop rebidding. Well, Hutchinson never came. It went to Mr. Razon, who had better connections at Malacanang then, and I don't know about now. But then World Bank to release additional $60 million loan. Subic Bay appears to thrive in Richard Gordon's wake, 98. If I recall, Dick didn't want to leave and that wake is not Dick is still very much alive. It's not that kind of a wake. He's running on the UNA ticket. World-class port soon to rise in Subic. Well, it did. It's there. The hardware is there. The software is not there yet. Okay, there. Thank you. Now, things got, in '97 crisis, things got a little bit tough for Subic, and they turned to smuggling, and they're still smuggling. 180,000 used cars came in, and I'll show you the effect on the legitimate auto manufacturing industry of that. Petroleum still comes in. Estimated 30 billion pesos losses in petroleum imports at Subic. Drugs, there have been, and more recently, rice. This is going on. Smuggling is going on in the country. It's on the front page of the Inquirer today. The effect of the inability to control the used cars, if you notice, these slides show new automotive manufacturing, right? Thailand is now over 1 million cars a year. Philippines today is 100 and Philippines is small, right? Thailand has grown. Philippines is flat. $2 billion in investment in the Philippine manufacturing industry has been weakened by an illegal activity. Maybe it's technically legal because you can get a court here to keep it legal for quite a while. As I said, the front page news today. The Commissioner of Customs yesterday, was in northern Luzon checking out whether the Supreme Court decision of January 7 applies to the cars that are being sold out there. This is deja vu for me because I was at Subic with 30 diplomats and business people. Faye will recall this, in October 2007, and they were slapping yellow stickers on 3,000 cars when the Supreme Court said, can't you read the language in EO 156? It says you can't import these. Well, those 3,000 cars subsequently slipped out into the general economy. They're all gone. The reason I'm talking about this somewhat is because you've got to be in the future in an Aerotropolis really, really clean. You've got to follow the rules. The investors need to expect that. They can't see smuggling of products that they're engaged in manufacturing, of selling, trading, logistics, etc., in the economy, competing with them. We have recommendations. I won't go through this here about Subic because I want to move on to Clark and then get to the end of this talk. The worst time, I said the worst time at Clark. I wasn't born in 1941. Anybody in the room who's 73? Anybody who remembers how MacArthur left Clark exposed and didn't take protective action to get the planes off the ground? You've all seen the photographs. So the worst time here, I'm sure, was during the Second World War. But Pinatubo came pretty close to it. I'm sure there are people in the room here that remember that situation. I have a memory of being at the State Department on a Saturday morning with a speakerphone and having Richard